Namaskar. On behalf of Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk. The Trust, as you would know, is actively engaged in preservation and conservation of India's vast heritage. And today, it is my absolute delight to welcome Dr. Annapurna Garimella, who will be speaking on the genealogies of the folk and the tribal. This talk will look at Indic and Indian ideas about the folk and the tribal, looking at materials from pre-modern period to the present with visual and literary examples of when these categories were imagined and institutionalized into everyday life of kingdoms, communities, and the nation. Dr. Garimella's research focuses on late medieval Indic architecture and the history and practices of vernacular, visual, and built cultures in India after independence. She is the managing trustee of Art Resources and Teaching Trust, a not-for-profit organization which is a research library dedicated to art, architecture, design, and crafts history. She also heads Jackfruit Research and Design, an organization with specialized portfolio of design, research, and curation. An author, her newest book is co-edited marked volume titled The Contemporary Hindu Temple, Fragments for a History. Her upcoming edited volume is titled The Long Arc of South Asian Art, a reader in honor of Vidya Daheja. Currently, her book manuscript under preparation is Digesting the Past, the Discourse of Sacralized Architectural Renovation in Southern India between the 14th and 17th centuries. So Annapurna, welcome once again, and all yours now.
Thank you so much, Manisha ji. I want to thank, before starting today, Ashwini Pai Bahadur for connecting me with Manisha ji and Intac, and also to the team, the background team whose face is not visible at Intac. Nishant, I think is his name is, and others. Thank you so much for doing this. And I want to thank all the audience who's taken time out of their very busy day at 6:30 in the evening to come and sit and join us for this conversation. So I think what I'd like to just do is basically talk a little bit before I start the presentation. I'll talk for about 40 minutes. And before I start the presentation, I'd like to just, let me just, give me a second. I will just go to the very beginning. That was supposed to be happening. There we go. Okay. Share this. Okay, is that visible to everyone? Yes, I think it's okay, right?
Yes, it is.
Can I get a confirmation, please?
Yes, it is. Annapurna,
yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to just briefly talk about the idea of genealogies of the folk and the tribal. This is not an art historical talk. I'm not tracing a linear history of ideas about the folk and the tribal from, let's say, the Vedic period to now. That's not what I'm going to be doing. What I want to do is instead suggest that there are many ideas about the folk and the tribal, and they converge in different ways at different moments. And I've picked a few key moments to highlight in this 40-minute talk. And the balance of the 20 minutes, I request our audience to bring your questions, your comments, your ideas to the conversation so that we can open up this topic for further discussion. What I'm presenting to you today, as some of you might know, I have been working on the question of the folk and the tribal through exhibitions and through essays for more than a decade now. There was vernacular in the contemporary at the Devi Art Foundation. Before that, I started writing about observing the Rupankar Museum at Bharat Bhavan, and also working at Marg as its editor. A lot of questions about how the folk and the tribal is represented in a publication that began the year before independence and came to represent the nation to itself and to others for so many decades. And then after the Devi Art Foundation exhibition in 2010 and 11, there have been other projects, important, small projects, but big essays for me, because I was I've been on a mission to really think about for myself, how might we tell the story? How might we tell the stories of folk and tribal communities, artists? How might we narrate their histories through art? I don't have full answers. It's a long project. I don't have that. I don't have that sort of confidence to claim any kind of authority over how to represent the folk and the tribal, partly because the histories of how the folk and the tribal were incorporated into other narratives, other social spaces, were part of social spaces, is completely unwritten in our country, except for maybe the colonial period, in some ways in the colonial period, and in some ways in the modern and contemporary period. And I will present this in the lecture. What I'm interested in doing, and this lecture today, this talk today, is the beginning of what I think is going to be a longer journey, which is, what if we put lots of other kinds of information in on our table, in our minds, in our field sites, in our conversations, in our archives? Where might we go? And I don't have an answer. This is a talk that's not going to give answers. It's just going to posit some instances, and then I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So once again, thank you for attending this rather propositional talk. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to put some propositions or some things that could lead to propositions in front of all of us. Thank you. So let me begin by one thing I want to propose is that the conversations about the folk and the tribal, especially when it comes to art, focus largely on certain kinds of communities. That would be, let's say, Madhubani in Mithila, or Warli in Maharashtra, Warli communities in Maharashtra, Pradhan Gond in Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh. We don't, and a few other communities, but we don't really have a larger understanding of what it means to think about folk in the tribal across many parts of India. We, of course, talk about this in terms of the Northeast as well. Sometimes we talk about it, let's say in the non-art world, we talk about it in relation to, let's say, Maoist conflicts, or environmental degradation, or the lives of pastoral peoples as they traverse landscapes. I don't know how the picture for art and our art history might change if we started expanding the regional geographic circuit in which we think about the question of the folk and the tribal. I'm not going to spend a lot of time delineating what is folk and what is tribal, although that is work that needs to be done. Another question then would be, like, for example, the work of I had a tiny experience of being mentored by the incredible late Komal Kothari. And he asked me to read an oral history of Rajasthan when it came in as a manuscript. And I had the great privilege of sitting on his bed with him as he was ailing in his last years, in his last days of cancer. And reading this book, and this book was amazing because he has very clear ideas. For example, what is the training of a classical musician and how is a folk musician trained? What is the difference in the way that learning happens? I'm not sure all those things can be directly applied to our own field of art and art history, but I think it's been very helpful for me to expand my horizons and talk to different kinds of people. And I'm hoping if I take examples from other places, besides Madhubani, besides Worli, Mithila, besides the Worli communities, the Madhubani art, Worli art, and Pradhan Goan painting. If I take other examples and come to begin to push the circuit in which we travel with this idea called something like the folk and the tribal. Of course, we all know that there was probably a completely different idea of what something like Margi and Deshi would mean. It is not a direct one-to-one relationship between the classical and the folk. And if people want to explore those ideas, one must read, for example, A.K. Ramanujan. You can also read people like David Shulman, and people like Komal Kothari. I don't have easy answers for any of these people like Sheldon Pollock. What it might mean for the art forms that I'm talking today, or the way I'm thinking today, I don't know. It will come, but not today. It will come, but not today. So another thing that I really want to emphasize is that I'm not going to talk about what happened to the folk in the tribal as colonial historiography, folklore studies, anthropology, national and post-independence folk cultures, folk institutes, all of these things, they play a huge role. I want to set that aside. I've talked about them quite a bit, and I want to set that aside for some time. And what I want to do is something different. So I'm going to begin this lecture by talking about Kannappa or Kannappar. And Kannappa is a saint, and he's a saint associated with a temple in Andhra Pradesh called Sri Kalahasti. He comes from the Bedar or the Vetar community, community of hunters. And today that community has been classified as a tribe, as a very backward tribe. I checked today to see if the classification has changed, and it has not changed. So when I think about Kannappa and Kannappar, I don't have an idea of them as backward tribes. My first encounter with Kannappa and Kannappar is as a child growing up in a Telugu-speaking family, watching films, and it was understanding of him as Bhakta Kannappa, as a great devotee. So it is from that position that I'm entering him, entering the question of the folk and the tribal in the context of Kannappa. So when we think about Kannappa, I would like us to pay attention to this gorgeous bronze at the Tanjavur Art Gallery. It's a Chola period bronze. And you have on the extreme left, the full figure of this bronze. He's a Utsava Murti, a festival bronze. And if you look at the middle three images, you'll see that the top image is of his head, and you will see that his eyes look different, and I will tell you in a second. And if you look at the middle image, you will see that his right hand has a ball in it. And if you look on the extreme right, you have a stone sculpture from the temple at Darasuram, and you will see that he's holding his japamala between his palms. So what is the story of Kannappa? So Kannappa is a Bedar, and he comes from a very elite hunting family. That's how the very important Periya Puranam, compiled by Sekkiyar, I am not pronouncing it correctly. I am not familiar with how to pronounce it in Tamil. I will teach myself, in the 12th century. And the Periya Puranam is, of course, a compilation of the stories of the Nayanars, the Shaiva saints. And Bhakta Kannappa is a Shaiva saint. So this bronze was made probably in the context of this compilation of the Periya Puranam, when the Chola King Kulotunga commissioned Darasuram and was consolidating many ideas about Shaivite worship. He was a follower of Shiva Chidambaram. And this bronze maybe earlier, maybe later, I don't know the exact date of this bronze, but it's a Chola period bronze. So Bhakta Kannappa goes to the forest, and I will tell you I will read from the Periya Puranam for you in a second. He goes to the forest, and he looks at a Shiva Lingam, and he feels great empathy for Shiva, this god. And he cleans him, offers him meat on a daily basis, the best meat from his hunt. He offers him flowers. And Shiva is watching him and observing him with a lot of love. And Parvati looks at him and says, "What is this? He's so dirty. How do you know he's a true worshiper?" And he says, "I'll show you." So the Brahmin comes to the temple every day and does some things. And Shiva makes the temple shake, the walls shake, and the Brahmin gets scared. And he leaves the puja unfinished. Kannappa, in contrast, covers the lingam with his body. Then Parvati doubts it and says, "Oh, this is just like a one-off thing. I don't necessarily agree that he's the Parama Bhakta." So then Shiva has the eyes on the linga bleed, one of the eyes on the linga bleed. And the Brahmin gets really scared and just runs away and never comes back. Kannappa, when he sees this, he feels so sad that he pulls out one eye. And that's what you see in the middle, small image in the palm is one of his eyes. And that's why in the central top image, you see that one eye looks different. It's because the sculptor has shown one eye missing. He pulls out one eye and gives it to Shiva's linga, to Shiva, and stops the bleeding. And Parvati is still not satisfied. So then Shiva makes the other eye bleed. And Kannappa is wondering what to do, because if he pulls out the other eye, he won't be able to see how to fix the second bleeding eye. So what he does is he takes his foot and he puts it in that place where Shiva's eye is bleeding so that he can yank out his eye and put it inside and give Shiva his vision. Because if Shiva loses his vision, how can his believers see him? How can he see his believers? Which is so important. Of course, Parvati also accepts that he's an amazing bhakta, and Shiva restores his vision, both his eyes, and blesses him. So this entire story around this hunter is captured by this sculptor. And the sculptor is not, both the sculptors, the stone sculptor, as well as the bronze sculptor, are really interested in capturing the details of a hunter's dress. You can see that the beads around his skirt are unusual. His skirt itself is not a tightly woven, not a tightly bound loincloth. It's a skirt. He has his bow. He's in his necklace, and his hair ornaments are also quite different from royal ornaments. So I will take you to this passage from the Periya Purana, and I'll read it to you. I put it on the screen for people who can't understand my accent. They straightened his dense curly hair and wound it. They decked it with chaplets of shoots. They stuck therein bright feathers of peacock. They also decked him with garlands of kurinji and jasmine buzzed over by bees. Round his forehead, they fastened a band of wool set with peacock quills and beans of kundri. That's what these beans are. If you can see all these beans that they're showing, that the sculptor is imagining this kundri. This is the woolen band. This is the band of wool. It's pretty amazing how much the Periya Puranam and the sculptures talk to each other. They adorned his ear with earrings wrought of white lustrous shells, bright like the full moon. There's no gemstones in the way that a god's gemstones are spoken about. His neck was adorned with white necklace, wrought of lustral beads of chanks and gems. Gems here would be, I would like to know the Tamil word. I don't know the Tamil word. I'm just beginning, so I'm just teaching myself. So please take this lecture as a self-learning exercise done in front of all of you. Into these were stuck crescent-shaped teeth of hogs. He wore Sannaviram, the triumphal garland, which was wrought of tiger skin studded with gems. So there's a lot of cross-material references. Gems can be for kings, but they can also be for a hunter. A god might wear a tiger skin or sit on a tiger skin, but he is wearing a tiger skin with his gem studded. On his chest dangled a garland of ivory beads, obviously from elephant tusks, right? On his shoulders, bahuvalayas were set. His forearms bore bracelets, and his hands that would ply darts with loud noise, matching the rumbling of the clouds, were with small wreaths decked. On his waist, he wore a tiger skin set with peacock feathers. White beads of shells were sewn on its borders. He wore a long garment of hide. A belt girded him. The sword with the leathern scabbard was fastened to his waist with a leather strap. The translator has used in leather, and I don't know why. Dyed ruddy with deodorant stuff. It's a complex, it's not, slightly awkward translation. On his foot, he wore the heroic anklet. On the soles of his feet, he fastened fitting footwear. He bowed before the bow, mighty and weighty, and duly circumambulated. He held the bow, pressing it with his foot, and strung it. He invoked the deity as he bore the bow thus. Now, if we go to the next slide, I want to then show you images. So on the top left corner is Kannappa putting his foot on the second eye. I saw on Twitter, I'm just scanning things, somebody saying, is that sculpture showing a man kicking Shiva with a full indignation? So it's a huge warning to all of us to be slow to take offense, because stories from the past are much more complex than our very narrow understandings of gods now. So in the top right is a Dasra Golu doll of the same image. And down below is the Kannada actor Rajkumar playing Bhakta Kannappa in a film. So I'm just putting this to give you a texture of how this story has traveled and how the folk and the tribal are meaningful in different media at different moments and for different reasons. So in the Periya Puranam, Sekiyar says, I have found him, but he abides alone. He's speaking in Kannappa's voice. There are none to feed him with meat, neither can I from him part. What am I to do? He must I get the needed mead. Thus he resolved. He would move away, but would come back at once. He would hug him and move away again. He would eye him in love, and he became like unto the cow parted from its young one, newly delivered. He would say, O Lord, for your feeding, I'll myself secure delicious and soft and flawless meat and be here eft soon. I have no idea what this translator was saying. I don't know this Tamil at all, but I get the idea. I hope you do too. Who should remain here as help for you? This thought prevents my parting for you. Neither can I suffer you to be hungry. Thus he spake, and his eyes showered tears. Apparently, Kannappa also liked Shakespeare. I'm just joking. Thus he spake, and thus he spoke, I suppose, and his eyes showered tears. He somewhat grew resolute, and with his long bow, moved away after hailing him with his flowery hand. So it's not directly related to the images, but it gives you a sense about the emotional experience that Sekizar might be giving to Kannappa and his feelings of love for Shiva. Now I'm going to take you to Kolarama Temple in Kolar, which is near Bangalore on the border of Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh in the state of Karnataka, and to the story of Chenchu Lakshmi. So let me just begin by taking you to this temple. This temple is quite old, but was renovated, quite old, meaning maybe 8th, 9th centuries, but renovated extensively in the late 11th century by Chola rulers, Rajendra Chola, for example. And what was probably a small esoteric temple was expanded. And you can see the scale of this temple from the left-hand side. It has a gallery around it. The body of the temple is something like what one would think of as a Kaveri belt Chola temple. It might have had images in the niches, there's none there now. But what's very important is that on the right-hand side, if you look a little bit closely, you can see that the wall is covered with text. And what is this text? This text is the Brahma Yamala Tantra. So this is a tantric text dedicated to a tantric goddess. I think the only known Southern recension of this text, which was tied to yogini worship, is very well known in Bengal, in Kashmir, in Nepal. Shaman Hatley has done an amazing work on this text, and you can buy a book about this. We don't have enough of an understanding of how this text existed here. We know that there were yogini temples in Odisha, Bhairaghat, Hirapur. We know they were there in Gwalior. And we also know that they were there in Tamil Nadu. The big exhibition on yoga that was done at the Freer and the Sackler curated by Deborah Diamond had an extensive section on yoginis. So I think we're going to, and there's a now deep study going on yoginis that's going to illuminate lots of questions and perhaps offer some possible answers to the worship of yoginis. This temple is very, very unique in the history of South Indian temple architecture and temple architecture, I think, across India. Now, when you see it, this is a panorama shot, so you get this funny bending quality, but you see it in this way. It's sort of unassuming, and it's relatively classical in its understanding. The scale is still small. And then inside, when you go, the middle very, very hazy picture is because the secret esoteric part of it is now almost impossible to see, and it's not easy to access. So what you see on the floor is probably the oldest image that's worshipped there. There's other images in front of it, but it's not easy to photograph. This is what I could get. I'll try again and again to do better. I've been here 3 times, and this is what I've been able to do. But what you see from the left-hand side and on the right-hand side is that it's a vibrant living temple, and women worship here, and it is very important to women on women's puja days, on like important women puja days. I happened to be there on one of those days, and women were making these lemon diyas. Now, when you look at this temple from the outside, you see that there's something interesting going on. So the 4 dark round columns at the center are very old columns, and they're made out of some kind of soapstone, much more finely carved, and are older. This temple, they were rearranged in this manner during the Vijayanagara period when another renovation happened. So when this renovation happened, some sort of reinterpretation of the esotericism of this temple, the yogini cult of the temple that might have been continued to be practiced, happened. And why do I say this? Is because during the Vijayanagara period in the 16th century, this large gateway was added. Incomplete gateway, doesn't have a gopuram. So when you enter the gateway, this is from the outside, you can see the temple in the inside. What you have on the 2 side, 2 sculptures on the door frame of this very large entrance are 2 tribal figures, tribal beauties. Let's put it that way, tribal beauties of the Chenchu tribe. So if we don't use the word tribe at all, they're Chenchu beauties, okay? So we know that these are Chenchu beauties because the story of Chenchu Lakshmi was quite widely circulating everywhere. So the Chenchu communities, also from the Nalamalai hills around this area of Andhra Pradesh, around Kalahasti, they are also considered a backward tribe. And today, not then, obviously, perhaps not, most likely not then, because the sculptures tell us that Vijay, the patron, the artist, maybe the gods, imagine Chenchu women as being extraordinarily gorgeous different from caste women. Beautiful, but different from caste women. They're powerful. They have bows in their hands. They have, there's a story attached to the man removing, holding her foot and removing a thorn from her foot, assisting her, let's put it that way, or an arrow from her foot. There is, she's wearing a leaf skirt. She has this gorgeous braid. Both of them have these gorgeous braids, very different from the buns that courtesanal or royal women wear, or Grihanis wear. Grihanis are domestic women, householder women. You can see the gorgeousness of the earrings that she's wearing. Her feet are particularly interesting. When I looked at these sculptures for the first time, I understood that the sculptors were telling us that this woman walks and she has strong feet. I myself do yoga and my feet have completely changed after doing years of yoga to spread. And the artist, the sculptor is telling her, she's not, her feet aren't about delicacy. They're beautiful, but they're about strength. And that in her beauty, she's very, very powerful. Her beauty makes her powerful. Her capacity to hunt makes her powerful. Her presence at the entrance of this temple makes her the temple powerful. There's so much going on here. And it's about a Chenchu woman. Now, Chenchu Lakshmi's story is tied to the story of Narasimha and Hiranyakashipu. So of course, Narasimha defeats Hiranyakashipu and he's very, very angry. And Lakshmi agrees to be born in the Chenchu community. And when Narasimha sees this beautiful Chenchu Lakshmi, he becomes Saumya Narasimha, Shanta Narasimha. From Ugra Narasimha, from the angry Narasimha, he becomes Saumya. So her beauty has that kind of power. Now, let's just think a little bit about the history of the Kolatem Amma temple and this Vijayanagara era Chenchu Lakshmi. It's a 16th century gateway. Now, there is another yogini who also holds a bow. Her name is Brahmari, and you can see her on the right. So were sculptors, were patrons also thinking about yoginis who held bows when they chose Chenchu Lakshmi to be here in the gateway? I don't know, but it's a thought. Now, as I mentioned to you, the story of Narasimha Swami, Narasimha and Chenchu Lakshmi, I'm showing you the very important Narasimha temple at Ahobilam in Andhra Pradesh, which is a classical temple. And inside of it, it's Chenchu Lakshmi and Narasimha who are worshipped. And you can see in the bottom, the Narasimha Ahobilam Mat, Narasimha Swami temple, Chenchu Lakshmi temple in Chembur in Bombay. And this is Chenchu Lakshmi on the bottom right in all her gorgeousness, her amazing dress. This is in modern India today. Have we forgotten that she's a tribal goddess? Or has her fact that she is a tribal person makes her even more special as a goddess? I want to explore these kinds of questions. What is our memory of understanding? What is our memory of our association as people who are come in modern India? How do we work with such memories, such stories? So this is an example. So if you go to Ahobilam, there's another temple to Chenchu Lakshmi, and it's a cave temple. And it's still active in worship. So this is the entrance. Obviously, it's going through some kind of renovation. There are the cement sacks. These are pictures taken all from the internet. And inside you see this. So there's layers of Chenchu Lakshmis being worshipped simultaneously in different spaces. And then, of course, there's sculptures like these. So here is Narasimha wooing Chenchu Lakshmi. And look at how she's depicted in a sculpture at the Ahobilam temple in a mandapa that is a late Vijayanagara mandapam. And of course, I look at this these two figures, and I look at the extreme right, and there is a yogini with a lion's head. So that's also kind of fascinating. I don't know what to make of all of this. There is this range of yoginis with animal heads, sometimes associated with male gods. The Brahmayamala Tantra and the yogini worship that it focuses on is present at the Kolatem temple. The Kolatem temple is given Chenchu Lakshmi gateway. Chenchu Lakshmi is worshipped in nearby Sri Kalahasti, not that far away from Sri Kalahasti. And there's a circuit happening here. So I'm going to leave it here. I don't want to spell out too many connections, but I'd like to say that I'm interested in, if we probe this and explore this and read more and look more and connect more, can our understanding of the folk and the tribal as a historical process, as a genealogy, evolve to become much richer and more complex and more respectful? And here, of course, are current, more recent representations of Chenchu Lakshmi. This is in Sri Kalahasti at a museum for the Chenchu community. And I put this again. I'm putting this not because I want to spell out lots of stuff. I want us to reflect just by looking. And then I also wanted to share with you, if I Google like Chenchu community, how are they represented in the mass media? So in Telangana, no road, Atmanirbhar Chenchus build one by hand. So there they are, building it by hand, the Chenchus. Or these two images which go side by side, Nagarika Teliyani Chenchulu. So people who don't know, Chenchus who don't know urbanism or urbanity, let me put it that way, is one representation on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side is a website, is a YouTube channel, which looks at Food Forward India Rural Escapes. So there's so many things going on. The Chenchus have to represent so many things for all our ambitions, for all our aspirations. When I say our, I'm talking about urban, middle class, and upper class communities. I don't know how much the Chenchu community engages with this YouTube videos in their own lives. That's something worth thinking about too. Now, I want to move to Central India. I would have put another slide, and I'm just going to call this Gondwana. So on the left-hand side, you have a page from the Akbarnama, which is in the V&A, in the Victorian Albert. And it's the battle between Rani Durgavati and Akbar's soldiers. And you will see that in the extreme left, in a palanquin, Durgavati, the queen of Gondwana, the brave queen of Gondwana, who fought Akbar's armies, is completely struck by arrows. She is dotted with blood. Her robe is dotted with blood. And she's represented with so much respect in this painting. And she kills herself rather than surrender in battle. Now, why were the Mughals so interested? Among many reasons, but one reason that they were very interested in Central India, what was Gondwana, is because it was the source of diamonds. So if you look at the right side, it's the Great Mughal diamond, and it came from the edge of Gondwana, which is probably the Kollur mines near Golconda. So I'm just going to read to you for a second from Jahangir's Akbarnama. And I want you to listen to this rather carefully, this careful account in Jahangir's account. He says, prior to this, my devoted Atalik, the Sipah Salhar Khan Khanan, assigned a troop led by his son Amrullah to go to Gondwana and seize the diamond mine in Barakar that was held by Panju, the Zamindar of Khandesh. On this date, a report came from him saying that the Zamindar had realized that to confront the imperial forces was beyond his capability and had surrendered the mine. An imperial overseer had been appointed to evaluate and record it. The diamonds from that mine, from the point of view of flawlessness and value, are superior to all other types of diamonds, and they are very highly valued by jewelers. They are all, without exception, better and superior. The second mine is that of Gogra, which is located in the land of Bihar. This is a geography of diamonds that I'm reading to you through Jahangir's chronicle. The diamonds there do not come from mines, but from a riverbed down which torrents run from the mountains during the monsoon. They dam it up, and when the flood has passed over the dam and the water has subsided, those who have expertise in this skill and who specialize in this work go into the riverbed and get out diamonds. That land has now been under the control of imperial servants for 3 years, and the zamindar is incarcerated. The water of that area, however, is extremely poisonous, and outsiders cannot live there. I find that fascinating. The third mine is in the Karnataka, next to Qutub Malik's border. That would be the Qutub Shahi kingdom. Within a distance of 50 kos, there are 4 mines. That would be the Deccani Sultan kingdoms. Within a distance of 50 kos, there were 4 mines held by zamindars. The diamonds from there are mostly of good quality. That's the end of this conversation in the Jahangir Nama. So I'm going to go back to my presentation. And give me a second here. And let me put this back on full screen and go to the next page. So I'm switching gears for a second here, but I want you to stay with me. So many of us know about Jangar Singh Sham, the late great Jangar Singh Sham, the amazing artist Jangar Singh Sham. And we know that he comes into the nation's history the way that art history tells it, when J. Swaminathan, the modernist, the person who founded Bharat Bhavan, sent troops of people, troops of anthropology and art students across the state of Madhya Pradesh to find folk and tribal art to put in his museum. So now I'm going to another anthropologist who was writing about these communities slightly earlier. This is Shamrao Hivale, and he was working with Verrier Elwin as part of the first batch of people who were recording in texts in the 20th century, the first batch of scholar anthropologists in the 20th century. So he says, in the old days, there were only Gonds and Pradhans in this part of the country. Little land was cultivated, but the harvests were good, and the few people there could easily make a livelihood. There was so much grass for the cattle that even the wild deer would come and feed near the villages without anyone troubling them. Our difficulties began when the Hindus and the Muslims came into the Gond villages and took the fruit of the harvest. The Pradhans, who were entirely dependent on the Gonds as their charans or their bards, were unable to get support, and the only thing to do was to steal. Then came the Great Famine, and the Pradhans could not even find anything to steal and had to go to relief works. So what was in there? Again, hold on to that thought too, what I just read. So what was in Gondwana? What was around Pradhan? So there was these very, sort of regional Khajuraho-ish, Chandela-ish, Kalachuri-ish sculptures. There were these kinds of hero stones. There was also this kind of a bronze, because this is, remember, we all know this by now, but I have to remind that this is iron-rich country, and that's why there's so much pressure from corporations to mine the land here, right? And then, this is the kind of stuff that Pradhan Gond artists, Pradhans were looking at and had around them. Gond patrons had around them. Other people had around them. Now, when Jangar Singh Sham comes to Bharat Bhavan, he starts painting in black and white images of Bada Dev, or relatively low color images of Bada Dev, the main god, one of the main gods of the Pradhans and the Gonds. So here's a passage that comes from songs translated by Verrier Elwin from the Gonds. In this kingdom of the English, how hard is it to live? To pay the cattle tax, we have to sell a cow. To pay the forest tax, we have to sell a bullock. To pay the land tax, we have to sell a buffalo. How are we to get our food in this kingdom of the English? How hard it is to live. In the village sits the landlord. In the gate sits the kotwar. In the garden sits the patwari. In the field sits the government. In the kingdom of the English, how hard it is to live. So this is the colonial era. Now, another song from that collection says, liquor, you turn us into kings. That's Mahua. What matter if the world ignores us? The Brahmin lives by his books. The Pankha boys run off with Pankha girls. The Dulia is happy with his basket. The Ahir with his cows. But one bottle makes a Gond a governor. What matter if the Congress ignores us? Now, I'm showing you a map on the left of all the diamond mines in the Panna area, the area that Jahangir was interested in. So this is also a story from the same book, Shamrao Himalayan Barry Ellion's book, and this is about Badadev. He's also called Badaben. In the former days, the Pradhan never paid taxes. Englishmen came to their country and told them that they must pay taxes just as the Gond did. Mana Pradhan said to the Englishmen that since Pradhan had no fields and lived by playing on the bana and singing, they would not pay. The Englishmen abused Mana and Badapen. When Mana heard this, he said, do not abuse me anymore. Come with me and I'll give you your taxes. Nearby, there was a great lake. Mana went to it and walked on the surface of the water. When he reached the center of the lake, he put his hand into the water and pulled out handfuls of precious stones. He threw them at the English and shouted, here are your taxes. Tie them to your hairs and go away. But the Englishman, when he saw what Mana was doing, was afraid and fell at his feet and became his disciple. He began to worship Badapen, and it was by the God's blessing that the Englishman got India under his control. I don't have much time to go into how complex this story is, but I'd like all of you to think about it with me. And then we come back to the story of Jangar Singh Sham and the story of modern and contemporary art from this community. This is the Madhya Pradesh legislature where he did these murals. And then the Manav Sangralaya and its representations of folk and tribal life in Bhopal. And then the newest version of folk and tribal life, the new museum in Bhopal, just on the other side of the hill from the Manav Sangralaya in Bharat Bhavan. 3 museums dedicated to tribal life less than 5 kilometers away from each other. That tells you how important these people are to us, apparently. And we have to wonder why. I say these people because the museum frames them that way, these people. They're people to be museologized. These are the interiors. These are all art designed by one of the installation artists who works at these museums working with various artists from different communities like Gond and other communities. And then I'm very fascinated and saddened by a project that happened under the agency of a noted curator, cultural entrepreneur, impresario, Rajiv Sethi, where the Adanis, who are so famous for their mining operations in both in Australia and in India, Rajiv Sethi put together a Gond artist and an Aboriginal artist, both of whom are there in this image, to do work for the Adani house. So complex, I tell you, our country. And then I'm really fascinated by Tara Books New, which has published so many books with works by Bhaju Sham, Durga Bai Sham, relatives of Jangar Singh Sham, and this new book that they've published called Between Memory and Museum. And I'd like to conclude my talk by reading from 2 pages there from this book. So this is Durga Bai Sham, who says, I moved to Bhopal from the village. Did I show you that image? Let me just see. Just a second. Did I come there? Yeah, let me first get there and then I will do this. Okay, I think I can read this from here. I moved to Bhopal from the village about 15 years ago. Soon after I started to paint for the museum, like many other women, I tried to work on wall and floor paintings, preparing the surface with mud and cow dung and drawing decorative patterns. Jangar uncle told me to remember our old stories and paint them in my own way. I'm skipping through most of it. The mother, the museum. For this artist, the museum has become a mother, is in her painting, in this painting that she shows us in this book, is stretching her hand out to all the tribal and folk artists who come to her, bringing all their things that are all the things that are important to them. It's so moving, that conception of the museum. And this is Bajusham in another page. He says, my image shows the museum as a tree. Whatever it is displayed as a token or symbol of our culture, let's say a drum has a soul. It was put on the floor and it really upset him, because a drum would not be put on the floor in Patangarh. The way things are kept and used also has meaning for us. So I'm going to end this here. This is not a linear presentation, but I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm glad we still have time for conversation. Thank you so much for giving me your attention this evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Annapurna. I am frankly riveted, and I would like to continue to hear more and ask less. So, so in the stream, okay, there is something by Asim, but he's just written half a question. What is the difference between, Asim, if you can hear me, please complete your question. In the meanwhile, there is a question by Anirudh, who wants to know what was the South Indian tantric text that Professor Garimella mentioned.
It's the Brahma Yamala Tantra. It's not a South Indian text. It was just put on the wall. It probably comes from Nepal and Kashmir. It was compiled, but it's the Brahma Yamala Tantra.
Then we have Anirudh, who wants to know that do we know anything about how Chenchu saw
Chenchu.
in the medieval period?
No, we don't. And I don't know if there's any archaeological information we can retrieve from, there's no archaeology in any of those areas directed towards recovering Chenchu life. I think we can begin to imagine something by touching the kinds of texts that I've been touching today. Touching, not probing, just touching. It's a very light beginning. And maybe we will come there. We will come to something in the future. Maybe you will do it, Anirudh. I hope. If you're an archaeologist by training.
You know, clearly, now this is something that's coming to my mind after listening to you. Clearly, there is a very close association between, you know, it's like the sculptors and the art is almost documenting the tribal way of life or the tribal culture or the tribal history. Would you say that?
I think it's one thing that's very important to accept is that at least in mainland India, many of these communities lived in extreme proximity to each other, not necessarily on land, but in trade, in accessing forest products, in having people to barter with. So there would have been familiarity with Chenchu people as people who had their own aesthetics, their own clothing, their own way of living. And what you see Sekizar documenting is that awareness, because he makes a difference between some other kind of person and how they look. So there's an attentiveness in and a pleasure in glorying in the beauty of the Vedar or the Chenchu.
Right.
So there wasn't this, I think it's very important for us to not imagine that the kind of bifurcation that we see in our government policies, in the way museums imagine, as there's a world of urban culture, there's a world of caste culture, there is a world of modern art culture, there's a world of contemporary art culture, and then tribals are something that we invite them into because we are being charitable or progressive or something like that. That's not the orientation of the medieval world. It doesn't mean that everybody was in each other's pockets all the time. There's one, Shankar Nair, who's written this very beautiful book. I've lost the title of it. He talks about that people could live next to each other in medieval and late medieval and early modern India and know that they existed next to each other, but we completely ignore them. You don't need to pay attention to everybody to accept that they live in your vicinity, right? You don't need to have an opinion on everything. You can let them be. And some of that would have also been there. The kind of awareness that the artist at the temple in Kolar or the poet Sekizar has of a Veda Bhakta. These are all important for their own reasons, but it doesn't mean that every community was always attentive to every other community.
So clearly in the medieval times, there was a greater, how should I put it, acceptability of plurality.
I don't know. Maybe they went on massacring people too. Who knows?
Versus today, we versus them, and whole concept of mainstreaming, that is.
Yes, I think maybe there wasn't this idea. Yeah. Yeah, I think that it's important not to impose, as you rightly say, a mainstream, the idea of a mainstream and a periphery on the past.
Exactly, we and they.
Yeah.
So I have Asim Kisku. What are the different? He writes, go.
Manish, I'd like to add one thing to what your question actually. If you look at sculptures, say in Hampi, there are images of warriors who come from forest communities whom we today designate as tribal people, fighting on behalf of kings. So this is also there as troops. So it's very complex. It's very, very complex.
Complex and layered. True. Asim writes, why are different Gond in Hinduism and Santal in animism? Gond, I suppose he means God.
Well, I don't know exactly that question, but I can answer the larger question that he's raising. Yeah. I can address the larger question he's raising. When communities live in proximity with each other, they're sometimes forced to accept the dominant party's way of life in some measure, sometimes in full measure. Very often it's mediated. So sometimes Gonds can be Christians. Sometimes they can take on Hindu gods like Shiva, and this has been going on for centuries. We have recordings of this from the Maratha period onwards. The Marathas were a very important force in this region. The Santals themselves and then they were Christianized in the colonial era, some communities. Similarly, the Santals have also gone through various experiences. So it's not like all tribal people have to be animist. No, that's not how they have lived historically in relationship to other communities with other devotional orientations.
So we are nearly, time's nearly up. So one quick question. This is from Katie Ravindran, who's a celebrated conservation architect.
Yes.
He wants to know, was the Chenchu Lakshmi temple originally without a roof Was it added by Vijayanagara?
You mean the Gopuram? The gateway did not have a Gopuram. The gateway was very often Gopura were added later. Over time, the patronage only covered the base, the stone base.
Right. There are lots of questions pouring in, but maybe that's for another day because we have to close this. And I know there is a whole treasure trove that you have, and at some point in time, another time, we would love to have a peek into that again. But till then, on behalf of the entire Intact family, I'd like to say thank you for this riveting talk and the way that you have put together a new perspective and theory. And hope to talk to you
Thank you
again.
so much to everyone and to Intact and Manisha ji and Ashwini Pai Bahadur and Nishanti for inviting me to present a very preliminary body of work. Thank you so much.